660 years ago, on a scorching July morning, nearly 2,000 farmers, men, women, the elderly, and children, were slaughtered in a matter of hours. Their bones were left in the dirt, still wearing their armor. And when archaeologists finally dug them up, what they found was so horrifying, so brutally precise, that scientists called it one of the most fearsome revelations of a medieval battle ever known. This is not just history. This is what war really looks like, written in bone. The island of gold and stone. Long before the blood soaked the fields of Gotland, the island was a paradise of commerce and prosperity. Situated in the heart of the Baltic Sea, off the eastern coast of Sweden, Gotland occupied one of the most strategically valuable positions in all of northern Europe. Ships from Lübeck, Riga, Tallinn, Novgorod, and a dozen other powerful cities all passed through its waters. And at the very heart of this island sat a city of breathtaking wealth, Visby. By the mid-1300s, Visby was a jewel of the medieval world. Its limestone walls stretched proud and high, encircling a city of churches, merchant guilds, and warehouses stuffed with furs, amber, silver, spices, and silk. The city had joined the mighty Hanseatic League in 1280, alongside Lübeck, Riga, and Tallinn, cementing its place as a premier trading hub of northern Europe. Merchants from Germany, Russia, and Scandinavia rubbed shoulders in its markets. Multi-storied stone warehouses lined its harbor. The city's residents grew rich, very rich, but wealth breeds envy, and Gotland's wealth had drawn the hungry eyes of kings. The island, while technically under the crown of Sweden's King Magnus IV, operated largely as a semi-independent entity. The city of Visby was cosmopolitan, diverse, and largely self-governing. But outside its walls, in the rural countryside, lived a very different population, the Gutnish yeomen. These were farmers. Freemen who tended crops and livestock, who carried old farming tools rather than swords, who had little formal military training. They were the backbone of the island, proud, hardy, deeply connected to the land they had worked for generations. But they were not warriors. This distinction, the wealthy, cosmopolitan city on one hand, and the rural farming folk on the other, would become catastrophically important on a single July day in 1361. The king with hungry eyes. King Valdemar IV of Denmark, known by the ominous nickname Voldemar Atterdag, meaning roughly Voldemar of another day, was one of the most formidable and cunning rulers of the 14th century. He had spent his reign systematically rebuilding Danish power after decades of weakness, and he was not done yet. In the years before 1361, Voldemar had already conquered the rich Swedish territories of Skane and Åland. Each conquest made him stronger. Each victory gave his treasury more silver and his army more confidence. But Gotland, with its legendary wealth and its critical position commanding Baltic trade, was the prize he truly wanted. His motivations were not simple. Yes, he coveted Gotland's enormous wealth. The island's merchant warehouses reportedly held treasures that made even powerful kings' eyes widen. But there were political and strategic motives too. Control of Gotland meant control of the central Baltic, the sea lanes that connected the entire North and East European trading world. For a king rebuilding an empire, this was not just a nice addition. It was essential. And so, in the summer of 1361, Voldemar assembled his army. It was no ragtag collection of foot soldiers. This was a professional, battle-hardened force of between 2,000 and 2,500 men. Many were experienced mercenaries from the Baltic coast of Germany, men who had fought in the brutal, grinding wars between the German and Scandinavian states. They wore what historians call transitional armor, iron and steel plates protecting vital areas over full suits of chain mail. These were men who killed for a living, men who knew exactly how to break an enemy line, men who showed no mercy. On July 22, 1361, this army landed on the western coast of Gotland. The invasion had begun. The desperate defense. The people of Gotland were not entirely unprepared. Word of the Danish fleet had reached the island ahead of its arrival, and the Gutnish yeomen scrambled to organize a defense. But what could farmers do against professional soldiers? The Gutnish force numbered roughly 2,000 men. But calling them an army would be generous. These were farmers, men who had perhaps participated in local disputes, who knew how to use tools but had never stood in a shield wall against armored mercenaries. Some had basic weapons. Some had limited armor, a chain mail shirt here, a coat of plates there. Many had nothing but farming implements, knives, and whatever they could grab. Their leader is unknown to history, likely a minor local nobleman with some military experience, attempting to coordinate a force of frightened, under-equipped men who nonetheless burned with the will to defend their homes. Among the defenders were not just adult men of fighting age. The archaeological evidence would later reveal something devastating. At least one-third of the Gotlandic force consisted of children and the elderly. Children. Old people. Defending an island against professional killers. What drove them to the field? Perhaps they had no choice. Perhaps the women and elders who might have stayed behind refused to do so. Perhaps they believed, desperately, fatally, that sheer numbers and the righteousness of defending their homes might somehow be enough. The Gotlanders first attempted to slow the Danish advance in the marshy lowlands of Maasterby, further inland. They set a defensive line, hoping the terrain might neutralize some of the Danish military advantage. It did not work. The Danes brushed them aside and continued their march toward Visby. The final confrontation was set. It would happen outside the walls of Visby itself, the very city whose wealth had drawn the invaders here. Ironically, the city's walls, the strong, proud limestone fortifications that had protected Visby for generations, would play no role in saving the Gotlandic defenders. Because the people of Visby refused to open the gates. Betrayal at the walls. This is one of the most haunting and debated details of the entire catastrophe. As the Gotlandic militia formed their desperate last line of defense beneath the city walls of Visby, the townspeople, the wealthy merchants and citizens inside, did not open the gates to let the farmers in. Why? Historians have debated this for centuries. Some suggest the city dwellers were protecting their own property, knowing that a horde of desperate, probably panicking soldiers flooding in might cause as much damage as an invader. Some suggest there was deep-seated social tension between the rural farmers and the cosmopolitan city population, a rift that had existed for decades. Others suggest simple fear and paralysis. Whatever the reason, the result was devastating. The Gutnish farmers and their families stood outside those walls. They could see the stone battlements rising above them. They could perhaps hear the voices, the movement of people inside. And they had nowhere to retreat. Behind them, the Danish professional army, advancing in disciplined formation. It was July 27, 1361. The final battle began. The massacre. What happened next in the fields outside Visby's southern walls was not a battle. It was a massacre. The Gotlandic defenders, farmers, elderly men, children, lightly armed militia, faced a force of experienced, armored professional soldiers who had probably fought dozens of engagements. The Danish and German mercenaries advanced in organized formations, using their superior armor, their training, and their battle-tested instincts to devastating effect. The Gotlanders fought. They must have fought with everything they had. The archaeological evidence confirms that. Injuries found on some Danish soldiers suggest the defense was not entirely one-sided. But the outcome was never truly in doubt. In a matter of hours, nearly 1,800 Gotlanders lay dead on the field. 1,800 people. In hours. Under the walls of their own city. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. The air would have been thick with screams, the clash of iron, the thudding of blows on flesh and bone. The ground grew soft with blood. The heat of the July sun beat down on the dying and the dead. And when it was over, the Danish army stood victorious over a field of the fallen. The survivors, those few who had managed to flee or were spared, watched from inside Visby's walls as the city's leadership made the only choice remaining to them. They surrendered. The ransom of Visby. King Valdemar Atterdag entered Visby as a conqueror. According to legend, and legend is the right word, as the exact details are disputed, he demanded an extraordinary ransom from the city in exchange for sparing it from complete sack and plunder. The iconic image associated with this moment, captured in a famous 19th century painting by Carl Gustav Helkvist, shows Valdemar demanding that the citizens of Visby fill 3 massive beer barrels with gold, silver, and valuables. He supposedly told the city that if they did not comply, he would destroy everything. Whether those exact barrels exist as historical fact or legendary embellishment, the payment certainly happened. The city of Visby handed over an enormous portion of its legendary wealth to the Danish king. And even then, even after paying the ransom, the Danes still plundered several of the city's churches and monasteries. Voldemar appointed Danish sheriffs to govern the island, and within a year officially added King of Gotland to his already lengthy list of titles. The proud, wealthy, independent island of Gotland had become a Danish possession. And outside its walls, in the heat of the summer sun, nearly 2,000 bodies lay rotting in the field. The burial. It must have been the heat that saved them for history, that is, though nothing saved them in life. The summer of 1361 was hot. Ferociously, brutally hot. And with nearly 2,000 bodies lying on a battlefield, decomposition was moving fast. The Danish victors faced an impossible task, stripping the dead of their armor and equipment before the bodies became too far gone. In medieval armies, stripping the dead of their valuable equipment, weapons, armor, coin, was standard practice. Armor was expensive. A chain-mail shirt represented weeks or months of skilled labor. Swords and weapons were prized. You stripped the dead. You always stripped the dead. But the heat was too intense. The sheer number of bodies was overwhelming. The decomposition was too fast. So the Danes did something unusual. They buried many of the dead with their equipment still on them. The bodies were gathered and placed into mass graves, at least 5 separate burial pits outside the city walls. Some bodies were thrown in haphazardly, a grim testament to the speed and practical urgency of the process. In one of the burials, however, 20 skeletons were found placed carefully, parallel to one another, in a roughly east-west alignment, suggesting at least some effort at a more dignified burial. And then the earth covered them. And the centuries passed. And Visby grew up around those graves. And the living went about the business of living, and the dead were forgotten. For more than 500 years. The discovery. It was 1905 when the dead of Visby finally began to speak again. A Swedish archaeologist and doctor named Oscar Wilhelm Wennersten, working with master builder Nils Pettersson, began excavating a site now known as Korsbättningen in Visby. What they uncovered stopped them in their tracks. The first mass grave. Hundreds of bodies, still in the ground where they had been laid more than 500 years earlier. The excavation revealed skeletons that were shockingly well preserved. The combination of soil conditions, quick burial, and the remarkable preservation power of time had conspired to keep the bones almost intact. And the bones told a story. A terrible, unforgettable story. Further excavations followed, the most important conducted by archaeologists Bengt Thordman and Paul Norland between 1912 and 1928. When the work was finally done, the total count of recovered human remains stood at 1,185. 5 mass graves had been located and excavated outside the city walls. The collection of skeletal remains from the Battle of Visby would become the largest battlefield skeletal collection in Europe. Scientists and historians from around the world would travel to the Gotland Museum, and later to the Fornsalen Museum and the Swedish History Museum in Stockholm, to study these bones. Because written in every fracture, every cut mark, every shattered joint, was evidence of what medieval warfare truly meant for the human body. What the bones reveal, the weapons. The osteological analysis of the Visby remains, the scientific study of these bones, produced findings that were groundbreaking in the field of archaeological trauma analysis. Researchers identified over 450 wounds inflicted by cutting weapons, swords and axes primarily, the slash and hack tools of close-quarters medieval combat. These wounds left distinctive marks on bone. Clean, sharp cuts where a sword edge passed through flesh and struck the skeleton. Heavy chopping wounds where an axe bit deep. An additional 120 or so wounds were attributed to piercing weapons, spears and arrows and crossbow bolts, the projectile instruments of the battlefield. These left different signatures, puncture holes, cracks radiating from points of impact, foreign fragments of iron still embedded in bone. And then there were the blunt force wounds, the crushing, shattering injuries left by maces, war hammers, and pole weapons. These produced catastrophic fractures, splintered bone, and compressed skulls that tell a story of tremendous force applied to unprotected flesh. In total, the researchers were analyzing not just individual deaths, but an entire archive of medieval military violence, the largest such archive ever assembled from a single battlefield event. The horrifying patterns. The deeper the scientists looked at the Visby wounds, the more disturbing patterns emerged. These were not random injuries. They were systematic, and they told a story of a specific, deliberately organized way of killing. One of the most striking findings was the concentration of injuries on the legs, specifically the lower legs. An extraordinary number of skeletons showed sword and axe cuts to the shins, the ankles, the feet. At first glance, this seems strange. Why target the legs rather than the body or head? The answer is tactical. Medieval military science understood that cutting a man's legs from under him, hamstringing him, slashing through tendons and muscle, dropped him to the ground without necessarily killing him immediately. And a man on the ground, immobilized and helpless, was easy to finish off at leisure. You could deal with dozens of opponents this way. Slash the legs, move on, let them fall, come back later. This is what some of the Visby evidence suggests happened. The defenders were being systematically disabled rather than killed outright in the first pass. Then finished off. A killing methodology that speaks to terrible, practiced military efficiency. The head wounds told yet another story. Most of the cuts and axe blows to the skull came from above, indicating the victims were already lower than their attackers when the killing blow landed. On the ground. On their knees. Unable to rise. The final mercy of the killing stroke was perhaps the only mercy many of them received. And many victims showed multiple wounds. Not one injury, not two, but 3, 4, 5 distinct weapon strikes on a single body. Multiple different weapon types. Multiple different attackers, or a single attacker cycling through different weapons. Injuries layered on injuries, as if the killing went on and on even after it should have been over. The face of a warrior. Among all the remarkable archaeological work done on the Visby remains, few discoveries captured the world's imagination as much as the facial reconstruction of one specific warrior. His skull was recovered from one of the mass graves and sent to Brazilian digital artist Cicero Mores, who worked with the Swedish History Museum in Stockholm to create a three-dimensional reconstruction of the man's face. Using photogrammetry, the technique of taking hundreds of photographs from different angles and using software to build a perfect 3D model, Mores first created a digital version of the skull itself. What the scan revealed was harrowing. The bones above the man's left eye and on his left cheek were shattered. Scientists determined this injury was most likely inflicted by a heavy pole weapon. A halberd, perhaps, or a war hammer, smashing downward with tremendous force into his face. But that was not all. The man's mouth and nose were separately crushed. A blow from an axe that split open the lower face. 2 different weapons. 2 different blows. Possibly 2 different attackers, or one attacker who first struck with a pole weapon and then pulled out an axe. Either way, this man's final moments involved a violence almost too terrible to contemplate. And yet, Mores brought him back. Using statistical data on soft tissue thickness and careful reconstruction, he gave this man back his face. A weathered, bearded, middle-aged man with Scandinavian features looked out from the digital screen for the first time in 660 years. He had a name once. He had a family. He had a farm, perhaps, and neighbors, and a life. His death was brutal beyond description. His face, somehow, makes all of it real. The children and the elderly. Perhaps the most morally devastating detail of the Battle of Visby came from the osteological analysis of the victims' ages. Osteologists, scientists who specialize in the analysis of bone, examined the skeletal remains in detail. They could determine age at death from bone density, the fusion of growth plates, tooth wear, and dozens of other biological markers that the skeleton retains long after death. What they found changed how historians understand this battle. At least 1/3 of the Gotlandic defenders, at minimum 600 of the roughly 1,800 who died on that field, were either children or elderly people. Not young adults. Not men in their prime fighting years. Children. And old men and women who should never have been on a battlefield at all. This is not a surprise, given the context. The Gotlandic militia was not a professional army. It was every able body on the island. When your island is being invaded and your professional defenders are few, you take anyone who can hold a weapon. Children as young as 15, perhaps younger, stood in that line. Old men and women who had survived decades of peaceful farming stood in that line. And they died. Some researchers suggest that many of the elderly and young among the defenders were not even primarily soldiers. They may have been supporters, carrying supplies, tending the wounded, or simply refusing to stay behind when their families and neighbors marched out. Whatever the reason, the evidence is clear. This was not a battle between professional armies. It was the slaughter of a civilian population. The armor of the fallen. One of the most extraordinary aspects of the Visby mass graves is what the dead were wearing when they were buried. Normally, when soldiers fell in a medieval battle, they were stripped of everything valuable before burial. Armor was expensive. A full chain mail hauberk, shirt, could represent months of a skilled blacksmith's labor. Weapons were prized. Even clothing had value. The victors stripped the dead, and the dead were buried naked. But Visby was different. Because the summer heat moved faster than the Danish soldiers could strip the bodies, many of the Gotlandic fallen were buried still in their armor. Intact chain mail shirts, chain mail coifs, the hood-like head coverings, gauntlets, coats of plates, a fascinating hybrid armor consisting of iron plates riveted to a leather or textile base coat, a type that would later become known to historians as the Visby coat of plates, named specifically because so many examples were recovered here. This accidental preservation created something remarkable, a snapshot of medieval military equipment frozen in time in 1361. Historians and military historians study the Visby armor to this day because it represents one of the best preserved examples of mid-14th century protective equipment in existence. The chainmail, preserved in soil for 550 years, shows the construction methods, the ring types, the repair patches where old links were replaced, the personalization marks of individual craftsmen. Some of the recovered helmets still had skulls inside them. Some of the chain mail gauntlets still had finger bones inside them. The dead had never truly been disarmed. The Gotland Museum and its silent witnesses. Today, the artifacts and remains of the Battle of Visby are housed primarily at the Gotland Museum, Fornsalen, in Visby and at the Swedish History Museum in Stockholm. For scholars, researchers, and visitors, these collections are among the most powerful archaeological experiences available anywhere in the medieval world. You can stand before display cases and look at skulls, actual skulls, bearing the marks of medieval weapons. A clean sword cut across the cranium. A depressed fracture where a mace landed. A piercing wound from an arrow or crossbow bolt. The Swedish History Museum has created a 3D scan of one particularly striking skull, allowing visitors to rotate and examine the injuries digitally, studying medieval violence in unprecedented detail. You can look at chain mail shirts that were sewn together by hands that turned to dust 700 years ago. You can see arrowheads, mace heads, sword fragments, crossbow bolts, and horseshoes, all recovered from the battlefield, all witnesses to the events of July 27, 1361. Every year, during Medieval Week in Gotland, a major annual cultural festival, a historical reenactment of King Valdemar IV's entrance into Visby is staged. Costumed actors recreate the dramatic scenes at the historical sites. Thousands of tourists come to Visby partly because of its remarkable medieval heritage, of which the Battle of Visby is the most haunting and powerful chapter. But the museum is more than a tourist attraction. Anthropologists from around the world continue to travel to study the Visby skeletal collection. New analytical techniques, DNA analysis, isotope analysis, advanced imaging, continue to reveal new secrets from these bones. The dead of Visby are still being asked to speak, and they still have things to say. What Visby tells us about war. The Battle of Visby is, in the coldest academic terms, an archaeological case study. It is valuable because of its exceptional preservation, the detail of its skeletal trauma record, and the historical context that allows researchers to interpret the evidence. But it is something more than that. The bones of Visby are a mirror. They reflect something true and permanent about what war does to human bodies, not the sanitized, heroic version of war that fills so many history books and films, but the raw, mechanistic, physical reality of organized violence. The reality that a sword blade does not discriminate between a seasoned warrior and a frightened farmer. The reality that an axe does not care how old its victim is. The reality that the dying body of a child in chainmail is indistinguishable from the dying body of a trained soldier. When archaeologists look at the lower leg wounds on the Visby skeletons, the systematic hamstringing, the methodical disabling of a population that had no real chance, they are reading a textbook of medieval military efficiency. This was not chaos. This was a practiced system. This was how professional soldiers maximized their kill count against an inferior opponent. And when they look at the multiple wounds on single bodies, 4, 5, 6 strikes on one skeleton, they are reading something about the psychology of the killers. About what happens to men trained to violence when they are given permission to use it without restraint. The Battle of Visby lasted hours. The slaughter of a city's defending population, farmers, children, the elderly, took hours. And when it was done, the perpetrators went on to ransom the city, appoint governors, and add a new title to the king's name. Business as usual. The wheels of power and politics kept turning. The dead just lay in the field. The legacy that never faded. King Valdemar Atterdag's triumph at Visby did not last forever. History rarely grants permanent victories. Within a year, political complications forced Valdemar to navigate competing claims over Gotland. Sweden's King Albert eventually claimed the island back, and Danish control proved short-lived. The Gotland that emerged from 1361 was changed, poorer, traumatized, politically reshuffled, but it survived. Visby itself, however, never fully recovered its former glory. The legendary merchant wealth that had made it the jewel of the Baltic diminished in the decades after the Danish conquest. Other cities, Lübeck, Danzig, Hamburg, grew in prominence within the Hanseatic network while Visby's influence waned. The city that had once dominated Baltic trade became a quieter, smaller place, its magnificent limestone churches and walls standing as monuments to a greatness that had passed. But the walls stood, and still stand today. Visby's medieval city walls are among the best preserved in Northern Europe. They are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists from around the world come to walk beneath them, to touch the limestone blocks that have stood since the 12th and 13th centuries. They take photographs in front of the towers. They stroll through streets of medieval buildings that have stood since before the massacre. And outside those walls, in the fields that are now parks and quiet green spaces, the ground still holds the memory of what happened on July 27, 1361. The mass graves were excavated a century ago. The bones were removed, studied, and placed in museums. But the earth remembers. And the bones remember. They are still speaking to us. The verdict of the dead. The Battle of Visby happened 663 years ago. It lasted a matter of hours. It killed nearly 2,000 people, most of them untrained, under-equipped civilians who should never have been on a battlefield. It was, in every objective sense, a massacre. The bones of those people are the most honest witnesses to medieval warfare we have. They do not lie, they do not exaggerate, they do not have political agendas. They simply show us, in their fractures and their cuts and their crushing wounds, what a medieval battle truly looked like when stripped of romance and heroism. They show us systematic leg wounds that disabled before killing. They show us skull fractures from blows delivered to people already on the ground. They show us the skeletons of people